Welcome to the Silicon Valley chapter of IEEE Computer Society. I'm the chapter chair, Vishnu Pendyala. Ours is the largest chapter in the Silicon Valley section of IEEE with over 4,000 subscribers in our mailing list, 1,400 plus paid members, and a strong following of over 12,400 on Twitter alone. We are uniquely positioned by the virtue of our location and available expertise. And we are fortunate to get speakers like Björn Schuller, Professor Björn Schuller today, who has kindly agreed to host a Ask Me Anything session on artificial emotional intelligence and more. World Economic Forum honoree Dr. Björn Wolfgang Schuller received his diploma, doctoral degree, habilitation, and was an adjunct teaching professor in machine learning and signal processing, all in electrical engineering information technology from the Technical University of Munich in Munich, Germany. He is a full professor of artificial intelligence and the head of GLAM at Imperial College, London, United Kingdom. Full professor and chair of embedded intelligence for healthcare and well-being at the University of Augsburg, Germany, co-founding CEO and current CSO of audEERING, an audio intelligence company based near Munich and in Berlin, Germany. He's also an independent research leader with the Alan Turing Institute of Royal Statistical Society Labs Data Analytics and Surveillance Group as part of the UK Health Security Agency. He's a guest professor at Southeast University in Nanjing, China, and a permanent visiting professor at HIT China, amongst other professorships and affiliations. His previous days include full professor at the University of Passau, Germany, key researcher at Joneim Research in Graz, Austria, and the CNRS LIMSI in Orsay, France. Dr. Schuller is a fellow of the IEEE and a Golden Core awardee of the IEEE Computer Society, fellow of the BCS, fellow of the ISCA, fellow and president emeritus of the AAAC, senior member of ACM. He co-authored 1,000 plus publications, which have 40,000 plus citations with an H index of 94. He is the field chief editor of Frontiers in Digital Health and the editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Effective Computing, amongst the manifold commitments and service to the community. His 40 plus awards include having been honored as one of the 40 extraordinary scientists under the age of 40 by the World Economic Forum in 2015. He served as a coordinator or principal investigator in 15 plus European projects. He's an ERC starting and DFG Reinhard Koselleck grantee and consultant of companies such as Barclays, GN, Huawei, Informatis, and Samsung. Beyond all, the best part I like is that he is really a humble human being. I really enjoyed interacting with him in the process of setting up this event. And I'm pretty sure we'll be enlightened by his answers. Links to this video will be posted on our website in a week. The video will be available on IEEE.tv. And also it's being live broadcasted on YouTube. Please feel free to post your questions on the chat window, either in the YouTube live broadcast or on Zoom. So with that, we can get started. Thank you, Professor Schuller, for your gracious presence today with us. And so do you want to say anything, or can I start asking questions?
Yeah, I would like to say thank you so much for the very nice introduction and for the very exciting invitation to talk to night in my hemisphere at lunchtime in yours. I'm really excited to answer these questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. So a lot of questions are with regard to your paper, your work on COVID-19 recognition, right? So your paper indicates that COVID provides enough markers that set it apart from other respiratory diseases, right? So folks were curious, what are those markers? Are the MFCCs, the mel frequency, substral coefficients, different in speech because of the shortness of breath due to COVID?
Yeah, thanks a lot. In fact, we have been starting to work on speech and COVID, I think, as the first paper in March 2020, where we had only 50 positive and 50 negative cases from Wuhan, China. Now we are in the lucky position to have several 10,000s of speakers. And of course, in this actually short period of 2 years in research, the picture has sharpened at unbelievable pace. What we can see is it's not particularly MFCCs, it's in particular higher order harmonics that are washed away sort of by the COVID sound of the voice. So you have a sort of specific hoarse sounding voice. The other thing that we have always been watching is, of course, this named shortness of breath. So you, funny enough, have longer pauses, but speak more quickly. We have often seen that because people want not to lose their conversational partners by taking longer than usually. So while they have to grasp for air, then to compensate for that, they would speak more quickly. We also find that prosody has changed and affected. For example, people have difficulties to sustain a clean pitch. So you have a lot of jitter and shimmer. So in other words, periods are altering in fundamental frequency from period to period and in energy from period to period. And you can hear some ah rather than an ah, which is a clean fundamental frequency. We also saw formants, so the spectral maxima being washed away. So you do not see such clear distinctions between formant 1, 2, 3 as usually, but that's also partially because the whole hoarseness and coarseness of the voice is washing away these higher order harmonics. The funny thing is that we felt at some point we can hear it. And as an anecdote, I once had a co-worker of mine calling and leaving me a message, and after 2-3 words I thought like, oh god, I'm using this one too now for a couple of days or weeks. And I just unfortunately after 2 years fell for COVID in the sense of I had it from beginning of March, and it happened to me that whoever I spoke to on Zoom or phone would immediately say, oh my god, don't tell me you got COVID. So by now, I think it is something that people are more sensitive to after being exposed to more and more COVID cases privately.
Oh, sorry to hear about your COVID. But it is interesting that even people have started recognizing the difference in the voice.
Yeah, I think it's particularly true if you know the person. This is something that we're largely missing in the studies, in the literature, because most studies so far have been collecting data from crowd sourcing, and people were donating when they were negative or positive, but there was anonymization of the data, and usually there's hardly ever the same person knowingly in the data set with and without COVID. In other words, studies that systematically investigate, can I get an advantage by hearing somebody's voice, knowing how she or he would usually sound, are largely lacking. We now have a data set that we're excited about to release in a few days, which is doing exactly that, look into can we gain something by personalization. But I think there clearly is an improvement, of course, in speaker-dependent, let's say, COVID-19 recognition.
Okay, I think you sort of addressed this, but other than MFCCs, is there any dependable feature for detecting COVID from audio signals?
Yeah, so pitch is one, and looking at pitch as a larger group of features. So shimmer, jitter, pitch variability, largely speaking. Then formants, so spectral maxima, that's like MFCC, somewhat related to spectral characteristics, and it all shows these non-well-defined overtones. So anything that describes this hoarseness clearly is suited. And we actually worked with end-to-end learning alongside traditional features, which are known by humans or experts. And we always found an advantage in using self-learned representations. In other words, there have to be slightly better things, only that thanks to the lack in explainability of deep learning, largely we could only correlate neural activations with known features. And some of these descriptions might have some information that we can't easily describe as a bonus over what we have been finding.
Okay. And we often hear that COVID symptoms, including cough, are often like those of the common cold. Your work proves otherwise. Does the medical community agree with your findings?
Yeah, the medical community is, as you may imagine, not unisono agreeing. Some are skeptical, but I had rather a very positive reaction experience. So we have been publishing with medical doctors like Professor Schuller from Lübeck in Germany and some colleagues in the UK. We have constantly been in touch with them. And what we found interesting is to do perception studies. Like what I said, can you actually as a human hear it? And we were particularly interested if medical doctors or health experienced people working day to day with COVID cases could hear it. With yet still lacking systematic perception study with experts, we have done some with laymen, and that was a bit frustrating, I have to admit. In other words, the machine was clearly an advantage in our studies, but usually I would believe that it's not so much because the machine learning is so much better, but it's probably just because the people were laymen. So we're yet waiting for, can humans hear it? But I would say the resonance overall from medical colleagues was very positive, that they believe in the power of AI, and then they can imagine that there is something.
Okay, yeah, that is good to know. And one of the common things that happens is patients sometimes show no symptoms. So is it possible to detect based on the patient's speech instead of cough in such scenarios? Whether audio AI can help in these kind of situations?
Yeah, funny enough, we first had the idea in March 2020 that we should do a symptom recognizer and then count the frequency of occurrence of these symptoms over a night, let's say, and based on that, judge on is it a cold or is it COVID. But we then quickly switched to using speech. So we started with looking at COVID severity. So we had hospitalization days and severity stages divided into 3 levels of severity, and could get that was clearly above chance level at some 70 to 80% chance normalized accuracy, the right degree of, let's say, COVID severity. Somehow we get stuck at this number for looking into directly from the voice, does somebody have COVID or not? And last year, we and also colleagues from India have been running parallel challenges where we were asking the research community at Interspeech, the largest speech processing and analysis conference, to challenge or themselves compete against each other. And we therefore had 2 different data sets, one European one coming from the Cambridge colleagues, one from India, that have been showing that yes, you can get it from speech. And since there has been an exploding number of papers on the topic, reporting quite different numbers. We are at this moment with the ATI, with the Turing Institute, looking into matched conditions in the sense that we want to make sure that it's not just picking up the demographics. So what is your age, what is your gender and so on, what are your symptoms, but really in a sort of factor cleaned up side effect cleaned up testing situation, can we still get it from the voice? Basically, I can say that this looks good, that we can recognize it, but it's not in the 90s, it's maybe not in the 80s, but rather in the 70s with 50-50 would be chance level. But of course, we're still improving on this, and we still don't have speaker adaptation, as I mentioned, so we're kind of positive that we can get better results.
Okay, good to hear. And this question is from one of my students. He is kind of curious if your team got a chance to investigate if the COVID cough can also tell if a new coronavirus mutation is in progress.
Yeah, we couldn't. So far, we have been working with the data that we collected. We have been, most of the data from the really large one now has been coming in during Omicron and a bit of Delta. So what we have been looking into is, can we tell apart Omicron from Delta, which would go into the direction, and we can now simulate, could we have find novelty in the sound that would have told us now there is a new variant ongoing. But the results are not yet in press, not even in preprint. And what I can say is that there is maybe a bit of detecting novelty. Of course, it largely depends how the new variant would change, let's say, the voice production and mechanisms. And what are the symptoms if it's symptomatic? How severe is it? Severely is it affecting your voice production mechanism, which includes cognitive parts, of course. And yeah, all sorts of other potential symptoms. So in short, this probably could be possible. We don't have yet tangible results, and it will certainly be much more challenging than in the first place detecting yes or no COVID.
So do you normally involve the medical community in your findings, or rather your premises, assumptions, and things like that? Do you ratify your assumptions with the medical community?
Yes, in fact, I'm a member of the medical faculty in Augsburg, Germany. And we have been indeed starting to collect data in our own hospital, in university hospital. But generally speaking, we're doing a lot of audio-based, speech-based health analytics. And we always work together with the medical colleagues, be it about Parkinson early detection or Alzheimer early detection, so neurodegenerative diseases, be it on the early end of neurodevelopmental diseases, from Fragile X to Rett syndrome to autism spectrum condition and so on. We couldn't do without them. First of all, we wouldn't get the data, but then of course we need a lot of expertise in understanding what we are looking for and what they are looking for, of course, also. Is it just a yes/no diagnosis? What would be of best benefit? So there's always a very close loop, actually, yes.
Okay. And so in your paper, I think you mentioned that there are more negative and positive samples than positive samples in the data set. So one of my students was curious as to how did you overcome the challenges of imbalanced data set?
Yeah, so this is a usual problem for us also in related tasks in the health domain always is. Here with COVID, it was interesting because the ratio was constantly shifting as more and more people got affected. That's also leading you to some drifting target learning. The virus itself is mutating, as we have been speaking about, but also the ratio is constantly shifting. What we can do on the one hand side is, of course, do balancing, trying to augment the training data for certain classes. These days, we do it more by nonlinear methods, such as generative adversarial networks or variational autoencoders, or also a lot of simple tricks like in mix-up or things like that, changing the speed, the pitch, the whatevers, where we're always careful that we don't change the actual class membership. So in short, on the one hand side, yes, by augmentation of weak classes. On the other hand side, yeah, indeed by loss functions. And that's not only for compensating in the first sense of yes/no decisions, but it's also these days a lot, of course, for fairness. So to make sure that it runs equally well for both genders, for different age groups. All of that is part of increasingly complex loss functions that cater for all sort of balancing out.
So how good are the GANs in that respect, augmenting the data? Do you find their performance pretty good, or?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you can't create true new observations. You can only toy a bit around with what you got. And as a rule of thumb, I would say usually if it all goes well, we can gain some 5% chance normalized accuracy. So what we call unweighted average recall. If it goes particularly well, we would still stay below 10% gain. So it can give you a bit of an advantage, but then we also figured that they don't give you much extra boost over simpler augmentation techniques. And it's not like you can combine them and each adds up, but there's simply a glass ceiling what you can do with the existing data to create some better new imagined versions of the data, is my experience for COVID, for emotion recognition, for whatever. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, we still actually need new data.
Yeah. And moving on to the next topic, which is affective computing. From the paper, it's one of your papers, Speech Emotion Recognition, 2 Decades in a Nutshell, Benchmarks and Ongoing Trends. So in this paper, the voice data used for emotion recognition is recorded data. Since the recorded voice has a different frequency with limited bandwidth than the actual human voice, some of the emotions could possibly be lost, misunderstood in the recorded data. Would it not impact the accuracy?
Yeah, so we have to look at this from two sides, I guess. On the one hand side, does it change the labeling? And there has been very little studies on the effect of bandwidth limitation for the labelers. On the other hand side, it will be from the machine recognition point of view, of course. But let's go back to the labelers. We have been doing some perception studies where we added noise. And part of that study was also to limit the bandwidths. The interesting thing is that humans are also affected by these changes. They are, however, from what we saw slightly differently affected from what we observed from the machine. We've been looking at this from confusion matrices point of view, and the confusions were slightly different between human and different machine learning approaches. But then, of course, even the different machine learning approaches do different confusions. So maybe this is not to be overinterpreted. Usually, however, the humans, I would hope, get high quality data. But yes, it's limited to maybe 16 kilohertz, maybe even lower than that. The same question would then apply: do you perceive emotions differently over the phone? If you imagine that also when you had the same person in the room, you would not see the person, but just hear the person. Probably not, I would speculate. But as said, we're largely missing good studies from the machines. And there have been a couple of papers in narrow bandwidth transmission to save bandwidths during transmission, and also simply for scientific curiosity, to see if you can even increase privacy by using very compressed speech and things like that. And it was shockingly good until we really went dramatic in bandwidth limitation. So I'm talking about below 4 kilohertz, even below 2 kilohertz. At 1 kilohertz, we really started to heavily degrade the performance. The reason probably is that emotion is largely encoded in the fundamental frequency. It's about prosody, and prosody is quite, well, actually, sometimes you do purposefully limit the bandwidth to focus on the fundamental frequency in pitch detection algorithms. So what I'm trying to say is that at very low bandwidths, you still have fundamental frequency, you still have a lot about the tempo information. So there's maybe some subtle nuances missing. And I have to say, however, that these studies have often been done with a coarse classification framework. So maybe just 7 emotions or 5, and maybe you're still missing some of the nuances in much more subtle emotions. Some of these studies have been looking into arousal, valence, dominance, continuous emotion dimensions. So you would say this is a little bit more telling in the sense of, are we missing any nuances, but still a lot of fine-grained things like social emotions, regulated emotions, and so on haven't been considered in such a context systematically. So in short, I don't think it makes too much of an impact, but we don't know for sure for very fine-grained things.
Yeah. Thanks for the insight. Yeah, that's really insightful. And the next question pertains to audio emotion detection. So as mentioned in one of your YouTube video talks, there's a lack of good amount of label data in the field of audio emotion detection. So how good are unsupervised and semi-supervised learning techniques in this domain? And how about active learning strategies?
Yeah, so you might say that there's always no data like more data, but in our field, it's particularly severe. Just to give some numbers, in speech emotion recognition or audio emotion recognition, we have often been working with 1 hour, 10 hours, and when we were lucky, 100 hours of material. In speech recognition, or ASR, automatic speech recognition, you have several thousand hours these days, and sometimes more audio than a human being is exposed to, at least speech, than in their lifetime. So we're very, very far off that. But to make things worse, we also usually have much more uncertainty in the data, so we need more than one labeler. So we're not only having not enough audio data, because there's always an internet full of data, 10 hours labeled data. And we would usually want more than one labeler, human labeler, so maybe 5, maybe even more than that. So we have to work with different kind of limitations, not enough data in the first place, but also a lot of uncertainty, and maybe not all data is labeled by 5 labelers. Some is only labeled by 1, 2. And then these techniques can help a lot also to compensate for the uncertainty and make the best out of even weakly labeled data. But to start maybe in the order you've been asking, unsupervised would of course mean that the machine finds its own clustering. This usually depends largely on the features you're using, of course, unless you're using some smart self-learning something that finds optimal features. And it can be very useful, as you can't give human understandable semantic tags or names to the clusters easily in a framework where you do end-to-end usage of emotion. So where you don't need labels like joy, sadness, but a machine recognizes emotions and reacts on that emotion and maybe shows emotion, but we don't care what it is, right? So we don't care if this is joy, and we don't care if what we react with to joy is also joy or whatever else, because it finds its own clusters. That said, we have been doing studies with unsupervised clustering, and it worked well, but we haven't seen many papers using such self-learned emotion representations in an app or in a usage context. And we're still lacking the experience, are those self-learned representations useful? Coming to semi-supervised learning, we have been showing that this works to some degree, but it's not massive. Probably the same answer as before. You can get your 10% if all goes well as a bonus, but usually you have to have a lot more data to exploit, and you have to have a good starting point. Semi-supervised as in first you start supervised, then you add the unlabeled data, self-labeled by the machine, some smart algorithms do some good confidence estimation and maybe keep only highly confidently labeled data from the machine, and then it works. Active learning is another one we have been massively looking into, and this looked very good. So we have been seeing papers reporting only 10% of the labels needed by humans, sometimes only 5% of the labels needed by humans to get the same heap in performance as if you had everything labeled. How is that possible? First of all, we have this massive imbalance in real life emotion. So people are neutral most of the time. If you look at me now, now I'm smiling, but most of the time I would be rather neutral because I'm talking about science here, right? And then you don't usually, whatever, show a lot of frustration, anger, joy, but sometimes it may occur. So what I'm saying is you have 60, maybe 80%, 90% of neutral. It would cost a lot of money to have humans label all that. So the machine can pre-select in active learning what is likely not to be neutral, right? That already makes a huge difference. Then it can go one step beyond and try to focus on which is probably something particularly novel. So would it change my model parameters, whatever it is in active learning. But what we also have in active learning in this field is, as said, we have not one labeler, but several labelers. And what we can optimize is how many labelers should we ask? Is it enough to have one because the labeler agrees with the machine and the machine on purpose asked a labeler that it knows would usually disagree with it, right? So you can have a lot of smartness introduced in whom to ask and how many to ask. So next you would say, okay, this labeler is in disagreement, and I know which labeler is next best to ask for this particular case. So we're not only learning about emotion, but we're also learning the labelers. We get to know sort of whom to ask when, and this is how we can end up with active learning with 5% of questions asked to get the same effect for the emotion recognition model. You can put the two together, semi-supervised and active learning, and end up with what we call cooperative learning. So the machine is part of the labeling process on the new data, and this dynamic active learning, which also learns whom to ask when, and the machine labeling all together can then really give you a huge, huge boost in not needing so much human effort.
So I was just curious, what is the profile of these experts who do the manual labeling? Like, how do you find them, and what is your level of expertise?
Well, to be honest, I think in the beginning, it usually mostly in the papers was people from the lab, in any lab, working on this, so students. Then it gradually moved into more delicate use cases, such as teaching autistic individuals about emotion, and we needed highly validated samples. Then sometimes caretakers or interest groups have been helping. So for example, we had a study where parents of autistic individuals were labeling the data. So again, you have laymen, but highly motivated laymen. And we had to have 65 parents agree on the same emotion before we put it into the bag of highly validated ones. So really hundreds of labels sometimes for the same data point. Of course, you also have the studies where you have psychologists or at least students of psychology label the data. So you can see any of these. What we're lacking is a couple of good papers relabeling the data by the same groups I have been naming now and finding the differences. So in other words, how much really is it giving you if you ask psychology students or psychological experts versus motivated parents versus students in the lab versus people on the street.
Okay. And we have an idea for you. So this is an idea to develop a lie detector based purely on audio cues. So we were wondering your thoughts on that. So because traditional lie detector technologies require measurements of the vitals like blood pressure, breathing rate, heart rate, and so on, which means lie detector devices are often complicated and immobile. So they also require the cooperation of the test subject. So if we have an audio only lie detector, it can probably be fitted into an electronic device that is a microphone, that has a microphone, and the test subject won't even know that they are being tested, which may help improve the detection accuracy. So do you think this is even feasible, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we have been looking into lie detection from acoustics and a bit from linguistics. We have been running this as a task in the Compare Challenge series I organized at Interspeech since 2009. And I think it must have been in I don't know, exactly 15, 16, something, where we had this as a task. Also to show what is not possible, because there have been always people trying to sell such technology to governments, and we're always worried about overhyped claims, how accurate they are. Now that said, we had a sincerity task where people were trying to speak very sincerely. And human perception ratings. And then we also had an actual lie detection task where people had to bluntly lie and we had to catch that. Of course, this data is always tricky to get, like emotional speech data, because getting people doing actual lies that matter to them because of the consequences is a totally different story than to have some harmless or easy white lies, whatever, in severity. So if you really think of these use cases like at the border or wherever, where things are really at stake, you want to enter the country maybe in an emergency situation, and then you really lie about your origin or whatever, this could make quite a difference to the data, of course. That said, however, we found that we can do it clearly above chance level at some 70+%, 50% is 50-50 again. And for sincerity, sometimes we went up to above 80%. But the real chance here lies in the linguistics. People who are lying are often trying to avoid causalities because they have to memorize too much. So if I'm telling, somebody is telling his wife a lie about where he spent last night, he might try to avoid to tell too much details, right? But somebody who really had a flat tire, and because of that, he had to go to the friend's house, and because that friend didn't have a screwdriver, they had to call another friend and so on. So this kind of causalities and deep structure in the story. This is something, of course, you can pick up with linguistics very well. And then you have another very good chance if you combine it with other modalities, which still might be contactless and still might be unnoticed. Maybe a favorite one here could be vision, and usually is. If you can afford for thermal imagery, it's great, because then you can also see people blushing, literally, and see that. But what more modalities give you is asynchronity across the modalities. Now, this already works for acoustics versus linguistics. You will still have an audio-only lie detector if you even have the facial expression, the body posture on top of that. It's kind of great, because if you lie, it's hard to focus on all these different channels at the same time, right? Hide all your micro expressions, control your pitch, think about the story you're telling. So you will have asynchronities, in short. Your face will sometimes show a different message than the tone of voice will sound like, and this you can pick up. So if you can pick up asynchronity between acoustic, linguistic channel, measure lack of causalities, and use the modalities each by themselves already to gain something, you probably get above 80%, maybe a little higher, but I would still always want to say a word of warning, and don't overtrust these technologies. They're still trained on often unmatched data, and we all know how AI can fail in sort of other conditions than they have been trained upon, at least these days.
Yeah, so hopefully sometime in future it will become a reality.
Yeah.
And dealing with all these topics which are on the edge of ethics, right? Ethical borders. So how does ethics affect your work? I mean, the ethical considerations affect your work.
So ethics are a huge part of what we do these days. We have just recently edited new special issues and a smaller book on ethics in AI, in particular also in AEI, so artificial emotional intelligence. With the World Economic Forum also, we have been working with the young scientists, so it's ethical standards where these kinds of perspectives were discussed. We had done workshops, but at the end of the day, talk is cheap, you might say, and what's it all good for? So we have to do more as a tech community than talk about ethics. And what we see here is the one thing which we're always trying to do is organize these challenges, as I've just mentioned, to have blinded test sets where people are invited, including the industry, to show what they can. But for us, it's also important to show what we can't do as a community, such that people, like I said, in governments or whatever, don't misuse such technology or over-expect or over-trust the outcome. What can we do beyond organizing challenges and showing what's working or what isn't? Of course, is providing protective technology. You can think now of adversarial attacks, for example, on AI. If you don't want an AI to spot if you're lying or not, you could use such adversarial attacks. Of course, you could then also maybe change the outcome, which could also be very dangerous. So you have a lot of ethics in that too. You could also hide your markers in the voice by voice conversion, either audible or non-audible to humans, so that even humans wouldn't hear it, which again raises a lot of ethical new challenges. If you can hide your deceptive voice, if you can hide your COVID-19, you're leaving quarantine because the AI doesn't stop you from entering a building. So the question is always, when we do technological countermeasures, which we believe are helping on the ethical end, aren't we raising a whole new set of ethical issues? So in that sense, we always must probably, consider very carefully the consequences of any countermeasure we also do with nothing but good intentions. At the end of the day, of course, almost anything can be used for good and for bad.
Yeah, and related to that, since your experiments involve human subjects, how easy or difficult has it been to deal with the regulatory framework, such as the institutional review board, stuff like that?
So just recently it became much more difficult with all the new changes in data regulation around the world, also often giving frustrating geo limits. So data may not leave the European Union or may not enter the European Union. Me, for example, working in the UK, which is now not EU any longer, and in Germany, gives me all sorts of headaches nowadays if I can use with both chairs or both university teams the same data easily, and sometimes we just couldn't. That said, of course, data regulations are good and have their purpose. I'm just saying it's also sometimes making it very difficult on our end. In the past, I have to say that when I say past, for me, it means 20 years ago, maybe up to 10 years ago, it has been shockingly easy to collect anything. And probably it was ourselves making people more aware about, oops, there's a lot of information actually just in the sound of your voice. If you can hear things like, are you lying or not? Are you having Alzheimer's soon? Even what is your heartbeat and so on. Maybe I don't want people to have my voice. People have been often much less worried about sharing their voice than sharing video feeds. And I feel like there's a whole new awareness now how much lies in the voice, talking about artificial emotional intelligence more generally, so not limited to voice. There's of course also much more awareness now about ethical aspects and people waking up literally that are afraid of computers knowing our emotions for all sort of reasons. So do I really want my computer to know when I'm tired, when I'm in a bad mood, and so on? So in short, with all these new successes from the research end, with all the raising awareness, it's become more and more difficult. I would personally, however, say that IRBs, of course, so institutional review boards, are usually always very reasonable, and they always support data collections as long as they adhere to reasonable protection mechanisms. And of course, one of our most vulnerable groups, for example, include minors, so children, when we collect children data. And then, of course, if we collect patient data, that's always one, two, three levels up in terms of how complicated it can get as compared to just collecting typical adult emotion data.
Okay, and the next question is related to asymptomatic depression. So in your video, there will be artificial emotional intelligence. It appears that with the combination help of smartwatch, phone, and artificial intelligence, it is possible for AI to identify and keep track of human emotions in the long term. If that is the case, will it be possible for artificial intelligence to understand and identify potential asymptomatic depression if long-term emotional data is collected? If so, will it be possible for artificial intelligence to provide personalized psychological assistance to heal depression? And along the lines, can we identify if one is faking their emotions?
Yeah, so first of all, depression recognition is a quite promising field for us. We have also been running this in challenges, mostly in the audiovisual emotion challenge, with different data collected in the lab, then moving into data collected with an AI from colleagues at USC. That was very interesting because an AI was virtually embodied by an agent, so some female psychologists or therapists on 2D screen that was talking in real time, showing affect and reacting to affect, and conducting an interview. So not a session really, but an interview. And from the data collected from that on PHQ-8, for example, people in the challenge were off at best by, so in the winning results were off by 4 to 5 points on a scale of 25 points. We also had back depression inventory, which is a scale of 64 points. And similarly, we were off at around 4 to 5 points on average. Now, you have to say that this is also uncertain. You have to ask several therapists or experts to label the data, and they also have some disagreement. So in short, AI diagnosis, even from unknown individuals on depression, it's quite promising. Now you mentioned the combination of smartwatch and phone and not speech and video only, or maybe only smartwatch and phone. We had the radar CNS project advanced into a very late stage now, which was running for 5 years with 25 partners in Europe, collecting data over years from thousands of individuals. And we're currently looking into this data. We also had other studies, longitudinal studies now. And this is rather recent that we have longitudinal studies where people really over months use their phone. Of course, you can much better adapt to them and get to know them. And then, of course, you will easily find novelty in their behavior, find changes in the behavior, and also find depression, in my sincere belief, in asymptomatic cases, because you simply know their usual behavior. And this is very powerful longitudinal data, including phone usage and other data you can collect with phone and smartwatches. Now coming to the next step, what beyond diagnosis can we heal, say, or provide therapy? It has been seen in these studies and also by other studies. It has repeatedly been reported that people find it easier to talk to an AI oftentimes than to humans, because they're not in a biased situation where, let's imagine, you want to impress the other gender, or you're feeling embarrassed by talking to some older, younger, whatever person. So these effects can fall away if you're talking to an AI, and it seems that people have been revealing more honestly and more information in total when talking to an AI. So now this could be also a chance, of course, in therapy. And of course, the therapy could also be good in the sense by an AI, as it is always available, has unshared attention, full focus, full memory. But long-term studies of how well this could work are yet to be seen at sufficient scale, I would say. So we believe that there is a vast potential in this, and this is for us really the next step, I think, as a community, to go into such long-term therapy, not only diagnosis sessions with AI guidance. Can we identify if one's faking their emotions? This is a matter of data in the first place, that we didn't have a lot of data of faked or regulated or suppressed emotions. We had a few data points coming from Geneva, from Klaus Scherer's lab, for example, that we looked into, and we could, to some degree, recognize if an emotion is suppressed or faked. However, I believe as more data, it will be becoming much more easy. And then we can also find value, of course, again, in knowing the person. I think this is always a key, something that we largely didn't exploit yet, personalization of these approaches. And of course, again, multimodality. So faked emotions or regulated emotions are very easy, again, to recognize by asynchronity of the channels. So linguistics and acoustics don't match, and let alone the visual impression and the acoustic control of the emotion aren't synced well enough. Maybe one thing that I didn't mention before was, funny enough, emotion and the change of emotion is also quite indicative of lies, by the way. So we have been looking into lie detection from predicting the emotion in arousal and valence dimensions, and high variability in the dimensions, in these dimensions, or in emotion and in general, is also a good indicator of lies. So in a way, you could be saying this goes along the lines of looking into lie detection, faking emotions. Somehow that's also some process where you try to control what you show and how you appear, and suffers from the same difficulties to control different modalities or channels at the same time, which we can then pick up.
So the future looks very promising for AI. And going through your work, all your research papers, looks like artificial emotional intelligence uses the entire spectrum of recent machine learning, particularly deep learning, reinforcement learning, and paradigms like federated learning, AutoML, and so on. So I was wondering, is there something that's still not explored for suitability for artificial intelligence, artificial emotional intelligence? And if so, why?
Yeah, so first of all, the field indeed has been a very early adopter of these new technologies. That probably comes as it is at the intersection of audio and video and other modalities, including brain-computer interfaces. So if machine learning technology is forwarded or fast forwarded from one modality, the community would pick it up in both cases, or in any case like audio. In the past, speech was a driver for hidden Markov models, maybe later CNNs and so on came more from the vision community. But at this intersection of different modalities, things are often early adopted. And in 2006, long short-term memory, recurrent neural networks have already been used in effective computing. Later in 2016, CNNs together with LSTM RNNs have already been used for self-learning representations. AutoML has been used in 2018 to self-shape the networks that then find the perfect representation. So usually it has been an early adopter. Now, reinforcement learning is more peculiar. There are papers that show the huge gain you can get. We have been doing one where we showed how much better a system can get to recognize atypical emotional behavior, for example, again, from autistic individuals. And reinforcement learning gave massive improvements. But real reinforcement learning at scale, where you have to solve real-world tasks as an artificial intelligence, exploiting the knowledge of human users' emotions and learning from that about their emotions is still missing. So it's not so much a new technology that is missing maybe, but just scaling up into real apps that use this kind of information and from that learn about it. Like in speech recognition, we have seen this and it worked very well. Federated learning, again, we have some papers now that show that it's feasible and that it works. What is now gaining momentum massively is self-supervised learning, but of course, again, that's true across AI, more or less, at least across pattern recognition or computer perception and interpretation thereof. So we are now seeing not only in computer vision for effective computing or artificial emotional intelligence, self-supervised learning, work like a charm, but in particular also for audio. Just to give an example, it has often been very difficult to recognize valence, so how positive or negative you sound from the voice acoustics. And with self-supervised learning, we have seen a massive improvement on that finally. Vice versa, arousal, so yeah, how aroused, excited, whatever you are, is usually not well picked up from the facial expression. And self-supervised learning gave some improvement on that. We can also do a lot of cross-modal learning. So as I said, there is a synergy between modalities, and we can gain from training an audio emotion recognizer on valence, as I mentioned, from a video valence recognizer, and vice versa, video arousal recognizer from an audio arousal recognizer. So maybe what is missing is a closer intersection between the modalities, not just in a very coarse or high-level way, but in a really massively intertwined manner. And the second thing that I usually keep saying what we're lacking is a closer coupling of analysis and synthesis. So let me just use speech emotion synthesis and speech emotion recognition as a paradigm. So the speech emotion synthesis community has for very long, and maybe even today still is partially, working with rule sets. Pitch has to be higher if I'm happy, tempo has to be faster if I'm happy, and so on. So a lot of speech synthesis for emotion has been rule-based. Now we have more and more Gans or other things in the place. And then you have the speech emotion recognition community, which has been massively machine learning, data trained, even already training their representations from data, and then the models for decision making. These worlds are largely apart. And now we have to get them much closer together. So we have already shown that with speech synthesis, we can augment the training material. We did this with the rule-based speech emotion synthesis in 2012, and it showed that it can work sorry, a bit better. Now that we have neural network speech synthesis, emotional speech synthesis, we get a little bit more improvement. The other way around is not so much in place. It's a little bit of guidance on the speech synthesis quality from the automatic recognition, but it's far from something really closely put together. As a human, we would never only learn to recognize effective information in the voice without synthesizing an effective voice ourselves. We're always toying around with both ends. And as we do that, we get a better understanding of how emotion sounds like. And maybe this is something more generally lacking in a higher level self-supervision perspective, not just trying to train some task that you can then use as a downstream, upstream, whatever task, but really trying to imagine situations. How would I sound like? How would the other one sound like? And really playfully go in instrumental exercises of imagining things and how they would go. So in short, coupling analysis and synthesis, and ideally in a very intertwined manner, and ideally in a self-imaginatory manner.
So I observed that you have been using the word self-supervised. So do you think unsupervised learning is a misnomer now, or?
Is it what, sorry?
Misnomer, I mean, is it a, should we not be using unsupervised anymore, or?
Yes, I mean, somehow it's, I said, very useful in cases where we don't have to have a human interpretable representation of affect or emotion, and we're just solving tasks, then we can definitely use unsupervised learning very usefully. However, in industrial solutions, the people on the buyer's end usually want to understand what's going on, and they want labels like joy, anger, or something that they can understand, that they can see and grasp if it's working well or not. And then, and if you're talking about representation learning, yes, of course, as well, yes, we can use unsupervised representation learning. We do that massively, but that's on the representation learning end, really.
Now, what I mean to say is, like, Jan LeCun, I believe, came up with this self-supervised learning replacement for unsupervised, right? So do you agree with that, or?
Well, we're simply combining both. For example, initializing representations unsupervised, and then on top of that, do some self-supervision. I wouldn't say that it's killing unsupervised. We can also combine, and also in different stages, in the front end or in the back end, different forms may make sense.
Okay. And speaking of the limitations of the technology and stuff like that, how is the artificial emotional intelligence landscape likely going to change with the advent of quantum computing?
Well, I mean, the major expectation, of course, is that once it's there, we can do massive amounts of computation at no effort. For us, this would first require enough data to be even able to do massive amounts of computation. We usually don't have a real-time problem once we have trained models, and it's not too computationally demanding if you can squeeze whatever networks, quantize them. So in other words, emotion recognizers are running on the smartwatch. So it's all about the training. But if we have quantum computing and we have a real-world task which is exploited at large scale, whatever that is, your depression assistant or just your user interface that uses emotion and really collects data from millions of users every day, and you put that together with quantum computing, of course, we could see massive improvement in our models in very short time. So speech recognition may be improved over a couple of years to this point where we really are satisfied with it. Maybe we could do the same with emotion recognition, scaling up, and then having quantum computing on top of that in even much shorter time. Yeah.
So we are nearing the hour, but I have a few more questions. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So in the paper, Predicting Sex and Stroke Success Computer-Aided Player Grunt Analysis in Tennis Matches, it is stated that an unweighted average recall of 84% was achieved in predicting the player sex. So I know it is a reasonably acceptable accuracy, but I thought that it should be even higher, since the grunting tone of a female versus a male player is very distinctive. Moreover, male players are more mistakenly predicted compared to female players, 12.5% versus 3.5%. So what do you think is the reason? And would the background noise of random audiences be a huge factor here?
Yeah, so particularly in the paper, we haven't fired heavy guns in source separation at the data. We do have heavy guns like Enhance. It's a toolkit of open source and free on GitHub using CNNs for speech source separation, and it actually works very well. And removing crowd noises shouldn't be too challenging, but these results haven't done major effort on doing that. So they are probably, and it's not only crowd noises, sorry, it's also general noises, of course, of all kinds. In fact, we had gender recognition once as a task, also in the compare challenge, and it was real world gender recognition in the sense that it was coming from varied age groups. In tennis playing and professional tennis playing, these don't vary so much. And it also included children. Once it includes children, you're clearly not at 90 to 100%, but you're at maybe also 85%. So maybe what's special here is that you're only having a single grant, whatever, and not a longer amount of speech available. And then, yes, you have background noises where you could do some more efforts on the idea of reverberation, denoising, and things like that. And then, of course, it's always a matter of data again. So if you collect much more tennis matches, you can certainly get a bit of an improvement. Why it's particularly confusing more male players as female players is a bit hard to guess. Maybe it's because of ambient noises which benefit higher frequencies or things like that. I could only guess here, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And I think it was Jeff Dean, if I remember correctly, who was talking about multitasking models. So I was just wondering if you have any opinion on that. How far are we from the vision of multitasking models?
So in many of the things we're doing, we have long since envisioned holism as our goal. If you're talking about COVID, we want to not only recognize COVID yes, COVID no, but we want to understand it all. Are you now tired? Are you anxious? Are you also having some comorbidity? What is your age, your gender, and to then best understand, okay, you really have COVID because we understand all these side factors. So holism is a very big desire of ours, and we have repeatedly been showing that in multitask learning, if you co-learn other tasks that are related or mutually dependent, whatever correlated, there is usually quite a gain, even if you don't need these tasks. That said, of course, there is also transfer learning much more in place these days. And once an AI understands more and more related tasks, it can also do much more versatile and useful transfer learning across tasks, would be the expectancy. So maybe you don't even have to have so highly correlated or mutually dependent tasks any longer once you have a much more generalistic AI in place. So how far are we from it? And talking about this holism within one discipline, let's say, like paralinguistic speech analysis, it's merely a matter of data and computation power. So I don't think that it's really a technological bigger challenge so much. Once we're really going across more distantly related tasks and want to have some very smart transfer learning across these tasks without catastrophic forgetting and so on, then it's also more of a technological challenge probably on top of pure practical reasons or issues that currently hinder us from having that.
And along the lines, what in your opinion is the next big thing in artificial intelligence or machine learning or artificial emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I might come back to what I said earlier in the sense of I would imagine AI to be much more self-reflective of situations, challenging itself, dreaming. Of course, there's already papers and all sorts of visions on that. But I think in practice, we have still way too focused papers on very narrow problems, of course, which are largely supervised, maybe a bit of self-supervision, a bit of unsupervised training, but not so much real high-level dreaming, let's say, or self-reflection. And that includes, of course, self-rewarding. So really imagining, praising yourself or being not satisfied with your performance. There is some papers on computational curiosity, of course, for example, by Schmidhuber and colleagues and many others. But putting these together, having an AI that is curious, self-reflective, imagining situations and coming up with its own rewards to go through much more higher level self-learning, put together with the transfer learning at scale and putting together all different sorts of tasks into one growing AI that can not only recognize COVID and lies, but all sorts of things and co-learn from these, probably is my vision for how we can make the next bigger step really forward in all of this.
Okay. And you seem to have achieved tremendous success with off-the-shelf implementations of machine learning algorithms like support vector machines. This is the case even with your popular work, the acoustic dissection of cough, diving into machine learning-based COVID-19 analysis and detection. So, and you also mentioned that you often come up with loss functions and new loss functions and stuff like that. So I was just curious, when do you sense the need to change the underlying math or the loss functions or come up with new algorithms?
Yeah, so it's right that we often got frustratingly good results with frustratingly simple models like support vector machines. Well, it's not simple per se, but just saying you would usually hope that you have much better results with a fancy new whatever. And then the data and the complexity in the task often don't justify that because you often struggle with data amounts. We have, however, always been embracing new tech, as said in 2006 already, long short-term memory recurrent neural networks. Sometimes we needed to come up with our own algorithms like deep semi-NMF, putting together deep learning ideas and non-negative matrix factorization ideas, because that was giving us an edge forward in separating audio sources. But then the deep semi-NMF wasn't needed so much any longer because the whole deep learning for source separation was becoming even better. We also had, for example, an algorithm for deep canonical time warping, putting together time warping algorithms with deep learning for the representation part across modalities. Unfortunately, often these algorithms that we designed are then too specific for a certain purpose, for a certain use case, even if they can give you some advantage there. And the community, obviously, for a good reason, embraces simple things that can be used across tasks and paradigms. So not much of these specialized algorithms then found usage outside of the narrow field and were overtaken by advancement in the larger machine learning field. That said, of course, we're still always looking into, can we do something better for our task, but at the same time, we're looking more into, can we do some new algorithm for the larger picture rather than for our small view.
And I had a question related to our profession. I mean, we are in the academia, right? So, and audio and your domain in general require large amounts of data and computing resources. So being in academia, how do you manage to get the data and resources you need? I mean, data, I think you kind of indicated, but the resources would be a challenge, I believe, right? Or is that not the case?
Well, for the data, I can say it's often very difficult to get access to the data from, let's say, the top players in, yeah, whatever, let's call them by name, from Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on.
Exactly, yeah.
What you can do there is found an industry yourself. That's what we did with audEERING in 2012. And maybe it was one of the major reasons that for me it was important to get access to things. And if you're only in academia, this can be more difficult. For the computational resources, founding your own company has to be very successful, I'm afraid, to give you the budgets to really get these kinds of computational powers that the before named companies would have. So at the end of the day, it's often about collaboration. And somehow, of course, we are in a sort of David versus Goliath situation. And that is good in the sense that as academia, it often forces us to think smart and come up with solutions, how to work with little data, how to work efficiently with little computational power. But of course, if you really want the access to it, we would usually be working together with those. That can sometimes be difficult also to publish them at the end of the day. And maybe that's another challenge. How do you, first of all, get access to it? And then second of all, also publish on it. But yeah, at the end of the day, really what we're doing is collaborate with big industry.
Yeah, this question is from Edward Kukla. It's just landed in my mailbox today. So it's a long question, but to summarize, do you think that AEI is a possible step towards a self-conscious or self-aware hardware software system?
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, self-aware and conscious in the sense of hard AI is always philosophical. It clearly is a big step forwards in simulating self-awareness and consciousness. As I said, we can use emotion as a reward in machine learning. This has been repeatedly been shown by colleagues, a bit by ourselves, that it's an optimization algorithm which is nature inspired as many others are. In this case, it takes inspiration from human emotion, and making an AI experience anxiety ahead of being tested or stress during learning and so on can be a very good optimization paradigm. At the end of the day, it can help in reinforcement learning. Again, this has been shown a lot. There's even more cognitive complex architectures that have been shown that use AEI, artificial emotional intelligence. But if it's at the end of the day really self-conscious, I think this is really for philosophers much better to answer than for me.
Yeah. Going into a slightly personal domain, what is your opinion of double-blind reviews when authors can post preprints on websites like Archive?
Yeah, double-blind review, of course, is always tricky because you would have to make tremendous efforts to really hide from colleagues in the field who you are by hiding statistics about the database often that you're using. Of course, then hiding any project name and so on. But even then, if the community is small, it's hard to really hide it from close colleagues because they know your writing style and so on. However, in a larger community where people would really have a good chance to hide their identity, of course, it's rendering it largely obsolete if you put it onto a preprint with your full name disclosed, making it clear that conferences that really want to assure genuine double-blindness can't accept preprints, I'm afraid. So, and we have more and more AI in this whole process, AI for plagiarism check, probably soon AI that immediately shows you the preprint and the similarity to the preprint of the current paper. So yeah, in short, if you really want double-blind review, you can't put it on preprint.
Okay, so you feel that the conferences should change their modality then?
Well, I'm not saying that we need double-blind so much because I said in my community, I am most of the time finding it easy to guess who the authors are. Then of course you can always probably at least guess their country of origin or things like that. But yeah, anything that can help to overcome human biases in a good way, of course, would be a good thing. But then you have to sacrifice preprint, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And do you have any tips that you can give to students who want to be successful in a machine learning career?
Yeah, I think the most important is to be passionate, of course, and to do what you believe in, even if nobody else does it. because, and even if people laugh at it, because then you're passionate, meaning that you invest your energy into something that you believe in, but that can also develop into the next big thing, right? Speaking of my own experience, I have been doing emotion recognition from speech in a time where there have been very few papers as a PhD student. And I had a lot of mocking colleagues in the lab. They would say that I'm doing esoterics with hidden Markov models. And they were laughing at me because I do a 7-class problem. They are doing 10,000 words speech recognition. So don't let others stop you if you believe in it, to develop your passion and follow up on it. Yeah, and the other thing that I would always recommend is only work for super high quality, because you're wasting your lifetime. You're better on a mountain skiing, snowboarding, or whatever you like to do else than doing mediocre science. So I would always say aim for quality and aim for what you believe in. And sometimes it can take until the reward comes, and that can be frustrating. I think deep learning is an interesting example of that. Many colleagues doing deep learning have been rewarded much, much later when finally there was enough data, fast enough hardware and so on to show what their algorithms really can do. And then their citation profiles have been skyrocketing all of a sudden, including, for example, formerly named Jürgen Schmidhuber or Sepp Hochreiter, the inventors of long short-term memory. But there are so many examples of this where people have been waiting for 10 or more years until it really became useful. It can be frustrating, of course. So sometimes you have to do something more popular to not get too frustrated on the side, but kind of don't give up on your dream if you really believe in something, and keep at that, and not only go for the easy bites, not only challenge papers with incremental research, but stick with some time in the week to looking into the bigger challenges, and always go up, not get stuck in your comfy conference, but always challenge yourself for the next thing. If you've done conferences, do journals. Later, if you've done journals, do maybe the first organization of a special issue. If you've done that, do the first proposal for grant money, maybe a national grant, then go up immediately for European, whatever bigger level, than for the excellence grant. So always challenge yourself, but that's the same in sport and anywhere where it's about competition. And science somewhat is about competition, of course. So follow your dream and preserve your appetite, your hunger for the next big thing.
Thanks, that's quite inspiring. And this one is the last one from me. Out of my own curiosity, from your talks in the YouTube videos, it is apparent that you watch quite a few movies, right? So I was wondering, how do you make time for writing 1,000+ papers and still be able to watch movies?
Yeah, funny enough, I personally don't feel like I watch so many movies, but I watch those which are related about AI or something like this to see what is the vision on this. But I do spend a lot of time on sports and music. And the thing is that I feel it's very important to keep things in balance, because you have to keep your
papers and I'm sorry.
You have to keep your desire for science alive. And if you do nothing else than science 24/7, you're burned out at some point, right? So I would usually keep quite tight schedule, like 1 hour of sports max a day, but then I should do it and enjoy it. And during running, during whatever sport, very often come the best ideas because you're finally clearing up your mind. So I feel like doing some leisure activities can also be quite a boost for good ideas. Playing music is maybe not so inspiring. It just gives you good time off. And watching movies, of course, can be, again, very inspiring if you're watching movies, let's say, on science fiction, AI. What are people expecting? What are they thinking about? Why not? It can be quite interesting. But overall, I think it's very important to keep a good balance. And in science, we're often running the risk to work all the weekend and never stop because colleagues are sitting in another continent. Emails never stop to pop up, and it's always this vibrant environment of there's always something going on, and you always feel like I can't miss out on this chance. I have to do this now, but then you shouldn't forget about what you else like to do, and more importantly, not forget about your family and people around you, and get completely absorbed in science. To then, at the end of the day, do better science because you're relaxed.
Yeah, I agree. I fully agree with that. So my chat for some reason is not working, the YouTube chat. There are quite a few folks watching, but I don't see any questions. Probably because my chat is not working, because I'm not able to send messages either. But if there are any, I will probably contact you or email or something, if that is fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so it was really very insightful talk. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us. I'd like to present this small certificate. Of course, it's nothing compared to the awards that you received, but just out of our own.
Wow, very nice. Very nice. Thanks so much, Vishnu, and thanks for the great occasion to talk today, and thanks to all the question donators.
Yeah.
to think about these things.
Yeah, quite a few of them were from my students. They are very curious. When I told them about you, they got really curious, and they started asking some of these questions.
Yeah, you clearly got a very, very good team there.
And so to end the session, so today's session was on artificial emotional intelligence, and next month we will have a talk on sustainability, green hardware and software. Dr. Ramachandra Gambhir will be talking on this topic. He's from Cisco. And in June, we have an open house, and that's when I will be giving my own talk on machine learning, the motor of modernization, and also present the state of the chapter. May, we are having a conference called NFIC, New Frontiers in Computing. So hopefully you'll all attend, take benefit of all these events. And with that, I once again thank Professor Schuller for his time. It was really very insightful, very enlightening, and hopefully we'll be able to meet again, and probably in person next time. If you come to Bay Area, please let us know, and we'll try to organize an event.
Excellent. Yeah, that would be fantastic. And let me know if you're around UK.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Björn.
Bye, Vishnu. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.